Minutes to introduce the panel. Thank you guys for coming.
All right, because now people are like.
Follonia Radio Art Mobile Rome. Sorry, Joe. Alex Bacon, seated in the center. He's a curatorial associate at the Princeton University Art Museum. He's written for numerous publications and authored texts in various exhibition catalogs, edited volumes on artists such as Francis Alise, Mary Corse, Josiah McElhaney, Ed Reinhardt, Neely Toroni, and Stanley Whitney. With Hal Foster, he is the editor of Richard Hamilton. Came out from MIT Press in 2010. James Hoff, to the right of Alex, is an artist and an editor living in New York. He's one of the co-founders and primary editors of Primary Information, a nonprofit arts organization devoted to publishing artist books. His recent and upcoming editorial projects include facsimile editions of Broken Music, Yeah, magazine, and Just Another Asshole. Megan Ann Liberty is the art books editor here at The Rail. I have the pleasure of working with this woman on a monthly basis. Her writing on artist books and the broader landscape of art book publishing has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Hyperallergic, Art and Print, the Journal of Artist Books, and the Brooklyn Rail, and elsewhere. She has an MA in art history from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. And with that, I welcome the panelists.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and thank you everyone at the Brooklyn Rail for having us enjoy this event, for this opportunity to have this discussion. I'd like to start off by saying a few words about the image that you see on the screen. This is the cover of the Second International Symposium of Molinology. Now, Molinology was something I'd never heard of until I had a conversation with Emanuele De Donno, whose book this was put forward in the exhibition that I did a year ago in Spoleto called 15 People Present Their Favorite Book, from which these pages take their origin. Now, molinology is the study of windmills, and Emanuele was in Amsterdam, and by chance he came across this book. He was looking in a bookshop randomly, and this book took his eye, took his interest. He wasn't at all aware of molinology before he bought the book. The book is a very strange combination which sort of falls between being an artist's book, being a manual, being a report on the proceeds of the Molinology Symposium, being a kind of blueprint for a future ecosystem that uses windmills as the means, total means of eco. It has a utopian feel to it. It also has a very pragmatic feel to it. It has diagrams and mathematical proposals. So it has this really extraordinary mixture of diversity. The way that Emanuele told the story is something that I find particularly interesting in this relationship between the anecdote, the thing that gets forgotten, the thing that we uncover when we start to look in artist publications, when we start to look around papers around the publications, and think about how these actually cast what we think we might know in a completely new way. So I'd like to give one other little instance of the exhibition and of these pages in this issue, the critics' pages. The kind of connection between Solowit's choice of book, which was Chester Himes' The Heat's On, in the first exhibition called 15 People Present Their Favorite Book, which was curated and devised by Christine Kozloff and Joseph Kossuth in 1967. He proposed The Heat's On, and by investigating early publications of Lewitt, I found that he had used the line, "Don't lose your head or your arse goes with it," which comes from the Chester Himes in his exhibition in 1970 in The Hague. And surprisingly enough, or maybe not so surprisingly, looking in the bookshelves in Spoleto, I came across a complete edition of Chester Himes' stories. And that was published in 1992. And there's something that is particularly poignant and often not thought about, that these hidden moments can offer in how we actually think about how an idea is important, or where that idea comes from, or what it is about it that actually matters. So now, without more ado, I'm going to say that we're going to be talking about exhibition as publication. We're going to be talking about artist books. We're going to be talking about forgotten moments and resituating these things. And we're going to be talking about other things that arise from this within us. And each of my panelists are going to speak about a particular, either one or two or three or four, a few case studies of such type of publication or situation that interests them particularly, that they are associated with. So first of all, Alex is going to talk.
Thank you, Joe. So I guess I'll wait for the slides to get loaded. Okay, we're loaded. All right, so when I heard that brief, I thought immediately of an artist, Olivier Mosset, who I don't know how many people are familiar with, but he was, or he's still living. He's a Swiss-born artist, and he became known in the mid to late 60s for these circle paintings, and he became famous specifically because of his association with the artist Daniel Buren, Michel Parmentier, and Anil Taroni, who together formed BMPT. And if you go to the next slide, so this is two of their manifestations, which happened in 1967 in Paris. And so what I want to talk about is an artist book which Mosset did early on in his career. And what I found is that when you contextualize paintings, this artist book, you find a very different artist than you find, for example, through the activities of BMPT. And that seemed to me the sort of thing that Joe was getting at in this idea of, you know, how these ephemeral things, and this artist book of Mosset is not very well known, but it played a very important role in his career because it got him his first solo show. So, you know, so BMPT, you know, the context in which this positioned Mosset's work is alongside, you know, the stripes of Buren, and then you have the horizontal stripes, which are a canvas folded and then spray painted by Michel Parmentier, and then the last being the sort of paint marks sequentially laid out of Neil Taroni. And so you can see in these displays that these were presented, and again, I would argue that Buren was really, you know, the sort of intellectual spearhead of this group. He sought out, you know, and put together these artists as, you know, in his mind being aligned. So he really dictated the terms. And Mosset, you know, is an interesting figure because he's almost the opposite of Buren, where Buren is, you know, a very prolific writer and lecturer and exhibitor. Mosset is much more taciturn and withdrawn and open about the interpretation of his work. And so he was very easily, also much younger than the other men in this group, he was sort of easily brought into this series of ideas. And again, the four men wrote, but I think again Buren really dictated several manifestos which were distributed at the four exhibitions or performances that they had. And I don't want to belabor the story of BMPT, though it's very interesting, but needless to say, I think that you can see that here painting in this context. So you have on the right, you have the, or I guess, Yes, you're right. You have the first manifestation where each artist painted their painting on site and exhibited it, and then withdrew the painting. And then on the left, you have the third manifestation, perhaps the most famous, where the audience was invited beforehand to attend a performance, a screening, and they come to the theater, and instead of a film or something on the stage, they're presented with the 4 canvases of the artists. And that was the only thing on view, and then it was again removed. So again, you have painting as performance, you have this critique of the institution, and also you have this sort of deconstruction, perhaps, of the terms of painting. So people have talked about how, you have the stripe and, the circle. These are ways to sort of delimit the basic terms of painting. And so this is very much the context in which Moset's circle paintings were seen, and he certainly hasn't done much to necessarily deflect from that, but nor has he necessarily contributed to that discourse. And certainly the fact that he subsequently became known and continues to be known as primarily a painter of monochrome paintings doesn't necessarily diverge from a certain reading that we're familiar with of sort of post-war minimal monochrome painting as institution critical and so forth. But if you actually do some research into the background of the paintings, if you go to the next slide for me, the first paintings were actually letter paintings of A's, and for me this introduces this sort of textual aspect. So perhaps the circle is also an O. And so if we go to the next slide, the first circle painting was not produced in an autonomous studio context, let alone for one of these BMPT performances, but actually a friend of Moset back in Switzerland was a film student, and he was doing a short film, which you're seeing film stills from, and he said, "Oh, would you make me some decor, just a painting to hang in the room?" And so that's what you're seeing here. This painting is not discussed. It has no role, except for the fact that, I mean, at least to my eye, it stands out. It's not what you'd expect. You see, it's a sort of young man. The story, it's about a 30-minute film, and the story is simply he gets up, he gets ready, some friends come over, they get dressed, they go out, and then he performs in a band. And then after the performance, the film ends. So I thought, first step, this idea of painting as decor and coming out of this sort of graphic textual context. And this also, for me, makes sense that, Moset's first job after he leaves Bern and comes to Paris, he's the assistant for Daniel Spoeri and for Tanguy. So you have this sort of context of Nouveau Realisme, a very different context than maybe the one of, again, of Buren and this sort of radical. Yes, so the book, which is the next slide, if you could click forward. So the book, so after BMPT sort of fizzles out at the end of '67, and things are kind of mounting towards May '68 politically in Paris, again, what's interesting to me is that Moset gets some funding, but what he wants, and for me this does relate to BMPT in the context of, for example, the sort of, the PR aspect of BMPT, the way that obviously these performances garnered a lot of attention and launched all 4 careers of these artists. And so what Moset does is he gets money and he does a book. And so what's interesting is that this book is conceived by Moset as an exhibition. And so there is no exhibition, but he produces a catalog, which he calls catalog number 1. You can see it's very simple. It's white cover, and then he claims that potentially even the image is just the same image, one painting, just reproduced, because of course they're all the same, so to speak, all a circle in the center of the canvas. And then he has a text which he commissions from another filmmaker, Serge Bard, who would go on to make a film. I don't have time to talk about that, but so this text is a fictional interview with Moset. Moset specifically did not participate, and I have a feeling I've already gone on too long, but I'll sort of linger with this book as for me, again, another way to see Mosé as playing a slightly different game. And I do think all the BMPT artists are very quite different from one another. But, you know, for me, this book, by returning the sort of graphic element of the paintings, repositioning them in this fictional space of exhibition and the catalog. And he likes to say, but I'm sure we could debate this, that he beat Siegelaub by about 6 months. Because, of course, in November 68 is the famous Douglas Hubler catalog, which is typically seen as the first book as exhibition. Mosé claims to have beaten him, but again, I would say there's something more French about this. There's something more. It's related to, like, Yves Klein did a fake catalog, this kind of thing. But anyway, so thank you.
Doesn't Bachner beat them by a good 2 years with his SVA Xerox show? Maybe. So who knows? Artist books. I just want to talk about a few different artist books that I've worked with recently through Primer Information. In the process, kind of talk about, or maybe propose, like the sort of idea that a book can play inside of an artist community, or inside of like the sort of relationship between a publisher, artist, and audience. Prime Information, when we started in 2006, we were sort of thinking about publishing a lot of archival stuff and a lot of contemporary stuff as well. So it was kind of always a mix. There was a lot of archival stuff that was out of print that we knew artists wanted and we knew students wanted, and a lot of people had access to material that people that didn't have a lot of money had access to, that were part of the conversation. So part of our mission was to begin publishing and reprinting stuff in facsimile edition. The first book I want to talk about is a book that was done in this way, and it's called Broken Music. And I want to, of course, how we think about artist books is the same way that Siegelaub and this crew would have thought about them in the 60s, this idea that artist books is this idea that the artist would conceptualize the book as an exhibition space, which could then be distributed throughout the world in various forms and ways. Some of the early practitioners of that sort of model really believed that artist books could replace pulp novels, or at least sit beside them inside of grocery stores and dime stores and places like this. That never really happened, but it was a good dream, I think, and it was a good ambition. So the first book, Broken Music, this is a book that is actually not an artist book, but I want to talk about it because there's a lot of artists that want this book and needed this book and sought this book out for many years. It was originally published in the late 80s. It is an exhibition catalog of artist records. It accompanied an exhibition that took place in Berlin in 1989. This book is devoted solely to artist records and also contains a 200-page discography of records made by artists since the beginning of the 20th century. I won't speak about it anymore, but I'll let you guys take a look. Please don't steal. But that is an example of a book that we would put out not because it's an artist book, but because it serves the artist community and it serves a community of artists and people who are interested in that material. And I think that sort of notion of the artist book, that it is that it has to be simply a book conceptualized by the artist as an exhibition space, is a very good model and a very good marker. But there's sort of some other relationships within that I would also like to highlight as things sort of progress. I think the next one is, did we get to Just Another Asshole? Is that later? Okay. So this is a book that's coming out. It's coming out in about 2 weeks on Primer Information. Just Another Asshole was a magazine edited by Barbara S. from the late 70s until the late 80s, I believe 78 to 88. Every issue took on a different form. There was a record, a tabloid magazine, a zine, or tabloid newspaper, a magazine, a zine, a couple other things. This book is the one that we're reprinting. The magazine basically took the form of a pulp novel, and Barbara S. basically had pretty much basically got submissions from about 62 contributors from inside of her community in downtown New York. She then published it as a sort of pulp paperback and then distributed it. That book, this book, well, it's not really a book, it's a magazine, but the reason why I think this book is important to talk about in this context, because it's a good example of an artist publication that can sort of draw in and sort of create a community through its publication. A lot of artist magazines have done that. But this, I think, is a really good example. This magazine captures downtown in the early 80s. So there's fiction by people like Kathy Acker and Cookie Mueller and David Ronovich, but also fiction and contributions from a lot of the no-wave and post-punk artists of that time, and also other visual artists like Barbara Kruger and Jenny Holzer and things like this. So it kind of defined a moment and also defined a community and exists kind of as a snapshot for us looking back historically. Let's see. Next one I think is Sarah Crowner. Sorry, going out of order. Sarah Crowner's book, this is sort of like more of like what I would consider a traditional artist book, in that it sort of functions as an exhibition in book form. And this is sort of an example of a book that Primary Information published to actually support Sarah Crowner. But in a way, it supports an audience as well, but it's really about Sarah, her vision, and her work. Whereas something like Just Another Asshole or Broken Music kind of go to support a larger community and sort of highlight a history that might be nascent or hidden in the present. So pass this one around. I would throw them, but they're sharp. I think this is the last one I'm going to talk about. This is a book. This is also a magazine published in the late 70s by a Swedish magazine called Kaleidoscope. This issue was devoted to George Maciunas, which you can see here. This is before he lost his eye to a mob in New Jersey. I guess the lesson, we're talking about anecdotes, the lesson for Maciunas is pay your plumbing bills. Anyone who knows Maciunas knows he was a very mercurial figure, and there are a lot of anecdotes about him that I won't go into. Yeah, do you mind? I think this magazine consists solely of a learning machine that Maciunas created. Yeah, but it goes vertically. But basically, Maciunas was an autodidact. And here, let's just pass it around. Anyone who wants to see the cover. Maciunas was an autodidact, and he created these sort of charts and diagrams that detailed art history and other sort of historical movements. This one in particular is the sort of historical formation of Fluxus, of which he was the sort of, he would say the father of, but definitely one of the pillars of, for sure. And so he basically charts the history of Fluxus, starting with the Greeks and ending with Fluxus, essentially. So it's a very grand narrative. Buster Keaton's in there as well. But that's a good example of an artist's magazine or an artist's book that can sort of define, also help define like a group or a movement with artists. I'm just going to talk about one more. That's okay. Sorry, I'm probably going over. This is a book by Vofostel and Dick Higgins. It was published on Something Else Press in the late 60s, early 70s. And basically, I want to talk about this book because it's a collection of proposals. In the late 60s, Higgins and Vostell thought that artists should really be thinking about public space and should be thinking about sculpture inside of public space. And so they basically put out a proposal and asked artists to submit proposals for public sculptures and public space. And the book that resulted was basically a collection of all of these proposals, and it kind of contains a pretty wide array of people, but a lot of Fluxus characters from Europe and the States. But I wanted to put this out there because it's an interesting book as a sort of artifact, but it's also, I think it's an interesting proposal to maybe think about the book as a sort of inside of a larger like social space in which artists can basically use the book to sort of collect ideas addressing like larger social needs. And I think the artist book has the potential to do that. I don't know that it always does it or does it really well, but I think as a proposal, it's a very nice idea to think about in terms of what the artist book can be or could do. So with that, I'll hand it over.
There should be one more. there's not one. Yeah, just an opening. Hey everyone. So my approach when I heard Joe's prompt was to go a little bit wider in terms of sort of the breadth of things that have influenced my thinking over the years about how writers and artists use the archive, found materials, sort of happenstance opportunities with materials to kind of make books, use them in books, and think about the history, which was kind of a way to make the larger concepts of the archive and the book, which are quite large, into more digestible, smaller pieces. So I kind of looked at my library at home and pulled out a few examples that have been touchstones for me over the years. And I thought I'd quickly run through some of these that have shaped my thinking and interest in the concepts of detritus, or discarded and forgotten ephemera, as sort of generative material and ways of activating the archive through exhibitions and bookmaking. So the first is this book, which comes from an exhibition, which was called Lists, To-Dos, Illustrated Inventories, Collected Thoughts, and Other Artists' Enumerations from the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art. So I saw this exhibition at the Morgan in 2011. And it featured to-do lists, diaries, expense reports, inventory logs, and other kind of things you'd probably throw away from the likes of Elaine de Kooning, Ray Johnson, Pablo Picasso, Joseph Cornell, and other writers and literary figures. In the curator Liza Irwin's notes, she writes, "Even the most mundane lists can be intriguing specimens of cultural anthropology. This book urges readers to consider common lists as firsthand accounts of our cultural history." And this was one of the first exhibitions I saw that got me thinking about what other materials artists and writers create and what they can tell us about their working process, their thinking, and what happens if we put these in an exhibition and use them as a cross-section of larger ideas. Another show along these lines worth noting is David Sr.'s 2013 Moma library show. Please come to the show. I didn't actually get to see this show, but I have the catalog, and it's another example of taking these kind of scraps of ephemera, making it into both a book and an exhibition, and thinking about what it says about specific moments. Another example is Susan Howe's investigation of Emily Dickinson's papers, which was published from a lecture, and this is called Spontaneous Particulars, The Telepathy of Archives, which first of all is an amazing title and I think really relevant to what we're talking about today. It's the most relevant to what we're talking about today, and how takes us through sort of the chance and magical findings that happen when sorting through an artist's or writer's forgotten and undocumented papers. So I've taken some scans here from the inside of my book, so you can see the kind of materials she weaves into her poetic investigation. And one line in particular stood out to me that I thought would be great to share with you. She writes, "Often by chance, via out-of-the-way card catalogs or through previous web surfing, a particular deep text or simple object, bobbin, sampler, scrap of lace, reveals itself here at the surface of the visible by mystic documentary telepathy." So her project is another example of what can be made from scraps of forgotten fragments as both research project and beautiful book object. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this book. It's published by New Directions with Christine Bergen. And it's a really beautiful, I wish I brought it, really beautiful, nice little hardcover tome that really speaks to how you can create sort of a textural object out of other material objects. Next slide. Yep, this fits just along with that. Andrew Monson's Letter to a Future Lover. This book has the subtitle, Marginalia, Errata, Secrets, Inscriptions, and Other Ephemera Found in Libraries. And it's published by Greywolf. And it takes the experience of reading a book, maybe a library book, or maybe a book you borrowed from a friend or a magazine, as the subject matter, and looking at what you might find stuck inside of the book, which kind of speaks to what you were talking about in your essay. And like the notes that you find, what might be written on the card, on the library card holder, things like that, and how we turn that into material for thinking about our reading experience and how these interjections change our reading experiences. Something else that got me thinking about artist books and archives was a programming event at the Center for Book Arts that I went to in March 2015. And it was called Innovative Practices of Presenting Archives to the Public. And it featured NYU Fales Library Collection Director and Curator Marvin Taylor, Franklin Furnace Director Martha Wilson, archivist and curator Andrew Blackley, and director of New York Public Library Labs, Ben Vershbaugh. And they each discussed how they create and display in exhibitions and online collections and publications, ways of activating archives. And I wrote about this talk in an article that was called In Readers' Hands, Archives Find New Contexts. So again, it's along this theme of what happens when we take this material, we repurpose it, we transform it digitally or into another book object. How can we share this and create a new experience where readers activate the material? Slide. Great. And then the last example, Fantasies of the Library is the first book in a series of books as exhibitions, which is called Interpolations, and it's organized by Synapse curators Anna Sophie Springer and Etienne Turpin. And the book got me thinking specifically about what could be done with the unique properties of the printed and bound book as an exhibition space. So I don't know if you can tell from the scans or screen grabs here, but one essay runs on the right side and then a different essay runs on the left side of the book throughout the whole book. And then in the center are images. So it's kind of really taking advantage of the spread of the book and the physicality of the book. I think you can tell from the different fonts in these examples. Yeah, and it got me thinking about the book as an exhibition space, especially in relation to its history as an object and its relationship to the library, the archive, and sites of institutional knowledge. So these were some formative examples for me when thinking about the archive, the artist's book, and how we kind of have chance encounters with materials in book forms.
Thank you all. This is completely fascinating. I think one of the things that is so that is always driving me on, and I think driving all of us on, is this sort of endless possibilities of what we can do with books. So how each occasion sort of generates another occasion. I mean, taking from what you've been saying. I mean, for instance, that Mel Bochner book. That was one of the ones that he put forward in that 15 people present their favorite book. So it was already being resituated in an exhibition format. So this kind of sense of like liberation of the context that gives always a possibility for something else is something that I'd like to sort of tease out a bit with each of you. To what extent, I mean, is there such a thing as, is there any kind of finitude, or what is it that actually keeps you going with these projects? Alex, if you'd like to give some thoughts.
Well, I guess in a way
With that particular book that you're talking about.
Right. Well, I guess I was going to speak more generally, but I mean, well, I mean, I was excited to be invited to speak on this panel just because I feel like, so I'm an art historian, by training, and I still think by practice, even if my practice sort of wanders into non-typically academic spaces. But I feel like the initial spark that led me into projects, like for example, the Mosaic, are those sort of triggers of these moments which most like typical art history would find, as you've said, sort of ephemeral, trivial, and then in fact they become these linchpins by which in some cases you can sort of rewrite history. I mean, not to necessarily be so bold about Mosaic, but I did find again that book, which is pretty buried within the Mosaic story, allows for a different reading of those paintings, allows for them to be sort of taken out of being like the B string of like Daniel Buren institutional critique, and to be potentially spun into an alternate history. And I think that for me as an art historian, I've often been drawn, I mean, we've talked a lot about different examples of this, different projects, one of which being the 15 people, it's their favorite book. So yeah, I guess that even as a historian, I mean, when you're sort of trying to tread back over ground that maybe can seem very familiar, often it is these overlooked spaces that provide ways that once you investigate them, somehow the whole story has changed afterwards.
And also the fact that very few people actually saw that 15 people present their favorite book, or at least we know that a number of people. It became very important, so very very close after the event, but the number of people who actually saw it was very, very limited. So I'd like, James, I'd like you I was very excited by the downloads of all those Seth Siegelaub books. I mean, to go back to the Siegelaub. So, I mean, that kind of freedom of access, which is something that you're so dedicated to with primary information, and the possibility of actually having these books in our hands. If you could just say a little bit about the project that you feel most successful on that.
Well, it's hard to say what could be most successful, I guess, unless you're talking about metrics in some capacity. But for primary information, like, there's a few different reasons why we'd publish a book, like, reprint a book, a facsimile edition, publish a facsimile edition of a book. One is to sort of address if the book's already in conversation, or a magazine's already in conversation. Something like Avalanche magazine, for instance, was in conversation long before we reprinted it. Just most people didn't have access to the original materials, so we felt like it needed to be back out in the world so that everyone could actually participate in the conversation around that magazine. In terms of what I find most successful, it is really hard to say. I mean, I think you bring up a good point. We also publish stuff online with permissions from artists and original publishers. And when we first started, Primary Information is named after Seth Siegelaub. And we first started, we began talking to Seth, and of course, we asked him if we could reprint some of those iconic, incredible catalogs from the late 60s, and he said absolutely not. And but he wanted to continue the conversation. We continued the conversation. Absolutely not, but we should have breakfast or lunch next time I'm in New York. And so we did. And then it's funny, speaking of anecdotes, I kept trying to speak to him, and during the conversation, like while we were eating breakfast, and he kept saying, it's so stupid to meet over breakfast because your eggs get cold. Like, you should eat first and we'll talk later. We'll talk after, which is what we did. I've never had a meeting over breakfast since.
Thank you.
But I just want to say one thing. So anyway, so Seth was like, okay, so you can't do that, but I said, well, can we reprint the artist's contract online? Because we were doing a show at PS1 devoted to 1969. We were participating in the show. And he said, sure. And so we published it online as a facsimile, as a free PDF, and it was downloaded, I think, 20,000 times in 2 weeks or something like that. And Seth was incredibly happy about that. And I mean, that's the kind of distribution you just can't get with regular books, like for the stuff that we're doing, at least. So he then gave us permission to reprint all of those catalogs as PDFs. So not really reprint, but to publish them as PDFs. And the Xerox book, I think probably the most famous out of that crew of books, was, I think, downloaded around 70,000 times in the first couple weeks, which means there's either a huge demand for that book, or there's like a lot of really smart bots, that love conceptual art. I'm not sure which, but yeah, exactly. I think though we can say that, I mean, Seth kind of didn't believe in publishing books after that. He really, I mean, he did, but he really wanted to publish things as PDFs because, it really satisfied, or it helped him reach this goal that he had with books about both dematerializing the art object and the sort of exhibition space, but also in terms of like getting the work out into the world with the least resistance possible.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback off of that, I think that for me, one of the things that's the most powerful about artist books is their capacity to circulate in these different spaces. And I think that's sort of what we've been touching on, this idea of alternative histories. The idea of a book and an archive are institutional structures. They create a narrative. They're formed by people in power. So then to take these forms and use them for something else, to take them into your own hands, make an exhibition that can then circulate online, be downloaded, and reach these audiences is a way of getting that message out and taking the structure and making it work for you in a different way.
And thank you. I mean, I think Megan, the way that you said piggyback is very particular.
Yeah.
Because this kind of like slipping in, almost like you don't even notice that it's happened, and yet it's definitely a strategy, and you can actually use the piggyback as a way to, resituate a circumstance or bring in a completely new audience, an audience that isn't aware that it's happening. And suddenly they realize, oh, I've almost been tricked, but I love being tricked. And what's going on with this? So I was very interested in when you were talking about happenstance and the sort of forgotten and the forgotten or overlooked, the thing that in a way makes lists, makes proposals, propositions, things that are on the way somewhere.
Yeah, and I think getting back, that relates so much to circulation as well, because I don't think any of these people intended for their list to be in an exhibition someday, but at the same time, we save things and we don't really know why we're saving them, but in a way we're creating this archive of our lives and our histories and our cultural moment. I really liked Liza Irwin's phrase there, that all of these detritus objects, they say something about our lives and our moment, and then what happens when we put them in this institutional form of the book, or we put them in an archive that then becomes part of the Smithsonian, which has its own histories. And then it's this happenstance of these objects literally and figuratively rubbing up against the other histories and the other archives that have then been institutionalized in these ways. Yeah, making new stories and new chance encounters.
Thank you very much. I think at this moment it would be a good idea to ask if anyone has comments to make or questions.
Listening to this, I was thinking of sort of, I guess I would say, women artists who the narrative is elect. And I was thinking of two artists who really, as we all know as critics, women don't get as much ink as men. When you are dealing with a man, you have a whole shelf of books, and when you're dealing with a woman, it's usually two self-published catalogs. And I was thinking of two artists. One is right here at the Guggenheim right now, Hilma af Klint, who left thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, and she only showed her work once in London. And so what she did is she made books of exhibitions where she would sort of photograph her work and then do it in color and then write these incredible narratives. And so now these books are just coming to light. They're about to be published. And another artist, I think, who really self-published all of her own books in a time long before Christine Stiles, long before anybody would touch her work, and that's Carolee Schneemann, who was lucky enough to have Bruce McPherson as a boyfriend at the time, and published Meet Joy and More Than Meet Joy. And I think that it is a brilliant writer. She writes about her own work better than anyone. And I think that for women especially, the fact that you have to often do an artist book because no one's going to write about your work. No one's going to publish it. You're not, and it was a real life-saving vehicle for someone.
Absolutely. Have you come across the two issues of women's work that Carolee Schneemann was in one of them, which was set up? Yeah. And I mean, calling it women's work, punning the notion of what women's work is in terms of housework, but work, the kind of expectations of what this is. I mean, that magazine, Anea Lockwood was one of the sort of principal protagonists of it, and they, and Carolee Schneemann and Alison Knowles, and they contacted a range of different women who were not necessarily visual artists, composers as well, and poets, and they produced these two issues. And I mean, this is the kind of thing that I think is the stuff that people don't know about because it's forgotten. It's on a shelf. So this is where some of what we're all talking about is so vágrant and so necessary to mark.
If I could just make a plug, forthcoming issue of the Book and Rail art book section, we'll be reviewing one of Hilma af Klint's notebooks, so she'll be getting some attention on our pages.
Can I do a plug as well?
Yeah.
Second plug. We just published a collection of Carolee Schneemann's writings, which I just started passing around. So.
I've got a question. James, I was really interested to hear you talk about the success you've had using PDFs. And as I was listening to you guys talk, I was curious what your feelings were about artist books as digital objects, like something accessible on a Kindle. Like what have you seen and what do you think about that format?
What do I think about it? I don't own a Kindle, I have to say, but I think it's great. I think that changing modes of like communication as it changes, and our relationship to communication can change. It can open up technology and can open up these sort of new pockets, which can provide a lot of opportunities for artists. So I think it's great if an artist embraces that mode, and I think they should absolutely. I think that in terms of like the larger picture, it hasn't really become any kind of competition in any way for the artist book. In fact, I think the artist book has actually grown more because of it, because there is a tactility to it, and there's things that you can't really reproduce in that sort of format. So someday you'll be able to, I'm sure, but it hasn't really affected the sort of artist books as like Primary Information is dealing with in terms of like the older stuff or the newer stuff, even in the way that it has for fiction or poetry. You know, I mean, the ebook has really kind of taken the wind out of the sails of conventional publishing in that capacity. But for artist books, not so much. But I think it's great when artists actually take on that form, and I'm kind of curious to see if like someone will actually sort of take it on and sort of like like really create something that is iconic in that mode, because I think that would be pretty difficult to do.
If I could follow up on that and just ask you, in terms of producing facsimiles, you talk again about the sort of materiality, the physicality, and I wonder if you could speak a bit about how you approach producing the facsimile, and what kind of material questions become important, or what kind of leeway you have, etc., in producing those books.
It depends, but for the most part, for facsimiles, like we want everything to be exactly like it was. Like we don't want any filter in between us and between the audience and the book, because if the book is a work of art, then we should approach it as such. So for us, it's like it's a pretty fussy process. We're trying to match the paper exactly. We're trying to match the ink exactly. We're trying to match everything exactly. It just does not always happen. And when it can't happen, we do the best we can, given either in consultation with the original artist or an estate or the original material. Some books that becomes more difficult, something like the Great Bear pamphlets, which had many different, like it's a series of pamphlets that Dick Higgins produced for Something Else Press, and there's 20 of them, and many of them have different types of paper from printing to printing. So it's not always the same color. It'll be the same pamphlet, but it's not the same color, not the same type of paper. So for that, when we have to make a decision, we essentially we make a decision based on the one we have, essentially. But yeah, I think for us, it's important as much as possible to match things precisely. But you'd be surprised at how hard that is actually to do. So, even the cheap paper from the 60s is very hard to. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, because actually sometimes that cheap paper has become, it's either obsolete or it's extremely expensive. It's completely changed around. I mean, like in magazines, when they use what in the UK is called ticket board, which is like a kind of thick, very thick paper, more like a thin card. It was used because it was so cheap, and then in about 1970, it stopped being cheap, and so there was no point in using ticket board anymore. And we get these kind of bizarre kind of things going on. Like obviously these books, which were actually extremely cheap, well, not really cheap, but I mean they were cheap enough for anyone to be able to buy, are suddenly, well, not suddenly, but have become so expensive, and as we say, stuck in libraries and you can't look at them. But do we have it? Yeah.
Published by Christian Siegelaub, or even early Stedijk, you look at, for example, whole entire volume dedicated to they would have the pleasure of designing the cover and several inserts that reveal their process. I know that in Minotaur, that's another place in thing. That would, for example, I think around the 437, commissioned a young author who was then invited to, for the first time, to England, staying with unlikely company, the great William Tate, who's known primarily as a great master printer, who had a print, I think, facility in Union Square, where every actress make prints there. But he's actually have a home in Wiltshire, England, and invited Melvin to come and stay for 1 summer. Then proceeding, giving him, Wuthering Heights, the book that he read. Then commissioned him to illustrate the book, which is so interesting because he illustrated only the first half of the book when the two lovers, I think Catherine and Heathcliff, was in love, because the rest were disaster. The point is that there was certain permission being made in a magazine that behaved like an artist book. So my question is that, would that be possible that we can do that the same today? I mean, otherwise, it's always that clear distinction, artist book, and then magazine, when you look at, for example, art right, published by another artist. You mentioned Avalanche, Louis Schwab was an artist, never kind of fulfilled his artistic ambition, but switched into publishing just to provide the history of dialogue and whatever the European artist was doing in the late 60s, 70s, whatnot, what the people in the West Coast was doing, and what was going on in New York. So that was a kind of mobilization, so to speak, to bring community together. But Artwright is similar treated, founded and worked by Edith de Arc and Walter Robinson. So my point is that can that coincide, happen, collaborating, instead of always staying very much in that clarity of boundary?
I would say, yeah, I would say yes. And I would also throw in something like Aspen Magazine and William Copley's SMS magazine. I mean, I think there's a lot of historical examples, but I think absolutely it's still happening. And I think those magazines, I mean, Artwright in particular, we've sort of been working on a facsimile of Artwright since 2011. It's been a long process. But those, like Artwright and Avalanche and several of the historical magazines from those eras, I think are, and even Just Another Asshole or Cover Magazine, some of these downtown magazines from the 80s, I think are really like real benchmarks. And I think also now that younger people are discovering them or being able to see them or have access to them or learning about them, even I think a lot of people are starting to work, or I think that tradition is still going. I think it's still ongoing to this day.
Kind of a follow-up, thing, especially when I think a lot of books are showing things, is I kept wondering which of these books helped heal a community. These books represent communities that was ready to heal. Which of these books came after that community formed and made it, and was perfect, like, and I asking this because of knowledge about the function of them, and it's going back to.
Well, I think like the Fluxus Machunas book, that's like very much an example of someone who's like putting forward like a certain history. Just Another Asshole is a perfect example of something that maybe came out of a certain community but wasn't meant to be necessarily read as a statement, but in hindsight has kind of become one. And I think there's a lot of magazines and sort of books that have functioned in that capacity. Broken Music is a book that had a very narrow focus, but has and since then become very that focus has become very like sought after in a way, you know. And so that book, which was originally printed in an edition of 1,000, will now be, the first printing was 2,500 copy or 2,000. So it'll be like 4,500 copies of that book will be out in the world now. The audience has grown as people have learned more about it. So that's also another thing. Like the book can also help an audience grow historically, you know, in hindsight, I guess, looking back. What do you guys think?
I agree with what you, yeah. No, I was still thinking about the magazine question as this was happening, and kind of the relationship to how magazines, because of their seriality and their ability to be published a little bit at a time, is another example of a way to give a sense of a community as it develops, as it's being formed. And I was also thinking about how that related back to what Charlie was asking about digital publishing and digital artist books. I think a lot of artists working now are doing a lot with blogs that they share, and doing a lot of experimenting and bouncing ideas off of each other with digital publishing spaces, in the way that maybe the serial printed magazine was back in the 70s when we're thinking about. And for example, like Paul Soelis's Library of the Printed Web collects a lot of these examples of artists working between the printed page and the digital screen, and ways in which this is a different kind of community of artists bouncing ideas off of each other in the moment.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. I think there's this possibility of the kind of hybrid and the kind of the shifting of stuff, so that actually keeping that more porous, keeping it more porous, so you're not actually necessarily designating it as an artist book, but it then becomes known as an artist book. I think, you know, that's with what I mentioned about women's work. It wasn't being proposed as an artist's publication. It was being proposed as, well, it was being put forward as like, this is what we're doing, you know, and it is definitely what happens after the event. But I think we should start to draw to a close, but yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add on to that. I think that's, again, another example of, you talked about you're working on a facsimile of art, right? And what happens to these materials that weren't artist books when they become collated in book forms, like book with a capital B, and become part of an archive with a capital A? How does that transform the material and how we view it historically, versus how it was maybe in the moment as it was being formed?
Exactly. I can see one hand. Yeah.
How the book fair specifically affects?
Yeah. Yeah, well, Nick is referencing in the September issue of the Broken Rail, there's an interview I did with Sanal Breslov, who's now the director of fairs and editions, I hope I got her title right, at Printed Matter, who does the big book fair. And we talked a lot about what it means, what the book fair space is for artists, publishers, and visitors, who the audience is. I don't know if I have time to continue on, but yeah, so maybe consult that interview if you're interested in that. And also, I think that it does provide a great opportunity to have that actual experience, a physical exchange of materials between artists, an opportunity to speak to your audience directly in terms of circulation, rather than downloading. You could speak to some of those 70,000 downloading users. And rather than having the material kind of sitting in a gallery space where people can take it, or in a bookstore, it gives you the moment as the artist to interface with your audience and with your readers. And I think a unique opportunity.
If I could sort of riff on that a little bit and go back to something we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is this idea of community. And what strikes me about something like the book fair is that you're seeing I mean, you're seeing a lot of sales, of course, but you're also seeing a lot of people who come who maybe don't have the money to buy even the books at the fair, even though, of course, there's a huge range of prices, so on and so forth. There's the zine tent and so on. But I find that what always strikes me at the book fairs is how many people come hungry to just sort of engage and see and sort of be part of what is essentially a sort of community, even beyond, you know, again, it's a fair, but I feel like it's very different than, say, you know, even an art fair where people obviously come just to see the art, but, you know, the commercial aspect is one thing, but there really is a community element. And for me, that's actually something that persists, of course, with artist books, because, you know, we can say that Ed Ruscha, for example, he prints, you know, so many copies of 26 gasoline stations, and yet the impact, the number of people who are responding to that book who don't even own it, where it's somehow in their psyche. And I think that, I mean, even in the more smaller case of the Olivier Mosset anecdote that I presented, but the way that that could have a role, you know, in the artist's own career, I mean, I think that it shows that there, you know, is something that, and maybe this is akin to artwork in general now, is that the artist's book has a role, obviously, as a commodity, you know, even in certain cases, a cheap commodity, but its role as something that sparks imagination and engagement and community on a bigger scale is perhaps its biggest impact.
And I think it comes full circle to Joe's original prompt that what you're describing is another form of exhibition space that the art fair provides for books to be displayed in that sort of encounter where you're maybe not going to buy them, but you just want to see them and look at them.
One more question. Just one more. The physicality you describe about how to replicate the exactness, whether the color, the ink, of the facsimile. I think that really amplified the seduction of the object. I mean, not long ago, 3 years ago, I paid nearly $4,000 for Black Mountain Review because it was a very issue that Franz Klein collaborated with Jim Oppenheimer, you know, because of that very physical skill of the way in which it was typesetting, the thinness of the paper, and the way how the image was reproduced through woodcuts. And I just love the way that Black magazine was made.
Yeah.
So I just want to add, would that be still counted?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think for us, it's a fine line between fetishizing the object as a historical document and like representing it or presenting it as the actual work itself. So for us, like we would take out like the aging that would be associated with a paper, you know, if it's yellowed or if it's thumbed through. We do everything we can to just make it look exactly like the original as. But
I think James, I think something that I think is very important is that it's not nostalgic, and there's a very big difference between, you know, recreating something in a sort of nostalgic fashion and actually recreating it in a way which is giving it a new life, a new situation.
Yeah, I think that's the. I mean, I think.
I mean, that's like, you know, to take apart the notion of the fetishized thing, which is like.
Yeah, I mean,
it's nostalgic.
I think it's an ongoing. I think it's a fine line. Sometimes it's hard to nail it sometimes, but yeah, that's the sort of plan, I think.
I'd like to thank my panelists very much for the evening. I'd like to thank Brooklyn Rail. And maybe we can carry on an informal conversation.